Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Dunstan Thomas Lunchtime webinar on CDC, the new kid on the workplace block. It is the 24th of March today, and that marks exactly 1 month since the Putin regime invaded Ukraine. Dunstan Thomas stands with Ukraine and promotes charitable humanitarian relief to the people of Ukraine. Today, we'll be talking about the wonderful things that can be achieved when people work together collectively. And that's the all-important letter C on the front of CDC, Collective Defined Contributions. We are at a very exciting point in the development of CDC. The primary and secondary legislation is in place, and the regulator, TPR, is consulting on its code of conduct. The first CD scheme will be launched by Royal Mail and is already hurtling down the runway. Meanwhile, we know that for governments have ambition that the benefits of CDC should be not just for large single employers, but should be available to the widest possible audience. And DWP are already discussing how to extend the first raft of legislation to bring in industry-wide schemes, multi-employer schemes, and commercial master trusts. To discuss all of this, we have two great speakers with us today. Angela Goff, who is head of corporate pensions at Royal Mail. Angela is responsible for Royal Mail Group's overall pension strategy, and in terms of the collective pension plan, she is the business lead for the implementation program of the UK's first single employer CDC scheme, which she is personally leading the company communications work stream. Before working at Royal Mail, Angela was proposition lead pensions and benefit at John Lewis during a time of significant change, when the John Lewis partnership closed the DB section of its scheme to accrual and changed contributions to the DC section. She also led a team to deliver financial education to partners to support them through the pension change and with their wider financial well-being. She's held pension consulting roles at both EY and Deloitte, developing a specialism in supporting companies through mergers and acquisitions. She qualified as an actuary in 2009. Our second speaker today is going to be Madalena Kane, head of DC governance and member of Aon's CDC specialist team. Maddie has around 20 years experience advising companies and trustees in relation to their DC and DB pension arrangements. She's currently working alongside a client to help realize their vision of CDC for employees. A core part of Maddie's role involves contributing to the future shape of the DC and CDC landscapes through her interactions with the DWP and TPR. Her activities as a member of the Association of Consulting Actuaries DC subcommittee and involvement with industry working groups. And representing Dunstan Thomas today, it's me, Adrian Boulding, Director of Retirement Strategy, where I provide market insight to Dunstan Thomas to complement the forward-thinking approaches of our software developers. Now, as some of you will know, I run a portfolio career. For completeness, I will fess up that I also work at Master Trust Now Pensions, at FinTech's buyer platform Solutions, who blend annuities into flexi-access drawdown plans, and I volunteer at charity the RSA, who run a CDC forum, which provides a space where supporters of CDC can gather and help promote the wider rollout of CDC. A little housekeeping for today. We'll start with short presentations from first Angela and then Maddie, and we will then discuss questions that you, the audience, put up. So please use the Ask a Question button, which you will see at the bottom of the screen. And importantly, within that, there is a button for you to vote on the questions that you would most like to see answered. So you can see questions coming through from other members of the audience and vote on the ones that you like. Our finish time today is 1 o'clock, and as ever, it's my duty to get us done in time, as I know you have given us 1 hour out of a busy day, and you'll want to get on to your next commitment on time. So, with no more ado, let me move to our first speaker, Angela.
Thanks very much, Adrian. I'm gonna talk a little bit about Royal Mail's history with CDC, what we've done so far, and what our next steps are, and some of our kind of learnings from the last few years of CDC. So the first slide we've got up there talks about, I guess, the history of why we've ended up in the position of being the first company looking to create a CDC scheme in the UK. So back in 2018, our defined benefit scheme closed to career average accrual because essentially the contributions in that scheme were about to become unaffordable to the business. We sat down with the Communication Workers Union, who's our main union, to talk through what we could offer as an alternative. They were naturally kind of against the idea of a DC scheme, but the DB scheme was becoming unaffordable. So that's how, working together, we came up with the idea of a collective DC as being the best thing for our people. What we agreed was a priority was that we had a pension scheme that gave all our members two things: a cash lump sum and a wage in retirement, and that's what our collective pension plan will do. And I guess as well as a cash lump sum and a wage for retirement, the other key objective for both us and members was that it was affordable. So the scheme as designed has similar contribution rates for members as the ones we've got now, and it's also got a kind of similar total contribution rate for the business as the ones we've got now. So it's designed to be sustainable, affordable, long-term for both us and the membership. You'll see there's a note there that we're a really big employer. We provide about 1 in every 172 jobs in the UK. So it's really important to us and to the unions that we get our pensions right and that we deliver the best pensions for our people. So that's, from day one, our collective pension plan will have about 120,000 people in it. If we could have the next slide, please. So this is talking a little bit about what are the benefits of a collective DC scheme for the members and for the business. So one of the key things really is that because a collective defined contribution scheme where everyone's money is pooled can invest in return-seeking assets for longer. So our scheme is designed to invest in return-seeking assets right up until retirement and then actually into retirement as well. What that means is that the modelling shows the expected outcomes are higher. There's obviously risk in that, but we can talk in that a bit more detail if anybody's got questions. But what that means is that the expected benefits are higher than a DC scheme with the same contribution rates. The other priority for us and the union was, compared to a DC scheme, it's much simpler for members to make decisions. Essentially, the investment strategy is decided for them. At retirement, it automatically provides members with that lump sum and a wage for life. So it doesn't require them to make difficult investment decisions, to decide, how to de-risk up to retirement. It doesn't require them to decide whether to buy an annuity, draw down, how to manage a drawdown. It's simpler. And because it provides a wage for life without buying an annuity, I think this is one of the really key bonuses of CDC compared to DC, is that pooled longevity means that somebody can have a pension that's guaranteed to pay out for life. The amount of it's not guaranteed, but it's guaranteed to pay out for as long as they live, but they don't have to pay an insurance premium for that. They don't have to pay a profit to an insurance company, and they don't have to invest in a kind of very low risk strategy in order to achieve that, which is what an insurance company does. So again, what that means is the expected outcomes are considerably higher than if you were to buy a annuity, again, albeit the outcomes aren't guaranteed in the way they would be for an annuity. The main benefit for Royal Mail is that it provides all of that to members, which is what they want. It provides them, a pension in retirement, not just a pot that they have to work out what to do with, an actual pension when they come to retirement, but at a rate that has kind of fixed contribution rates and therefore known costs to us. And that makes it sustainable in a way that our DB scheme wasn't anymore. You'll see on the left, there's a couple of pictures. They look, I'm sure, very small on your screen, but they're kind of screenshots from some of the recent communications we've done. I mean, I'm a kind of passionately believe that pension communications generally could be better and probably should be better. But in CDC schemes especially, it's really important that members understand what's going to happen. Increases in those schemes can go up and down, and there can even be decreases. And when that happens, it's important that members understand that was part of the scheme design. They shouldn't panic. That's what they knew was going to happen. So communication is absolutely critical, and transparency is too. So we've spent a lot of time over the last few years trying to get our communications right. Soon the trustees of the scheme will start communicating as well with annual pension statements and kind of increase announcements each year. And we're both, working iteratively to learn, hold focus groups, learn what lands with members, what doesn't. How can we use the simplest language available to explain what is quite a complicated benefit structure? If we could have the next slide. So I won't spend too much on this. It's essentially our scheme design. So the scheme has a CDC section, which is essentially DC in nature in the sense that our contributions are fixed, and a lump sum section which has a DB underpin. So the CDC section members accrue 80ths, like they did in our career average scheme. Increases to that were entirely dependent on how the assets perform and what's expected to happen in future, kind of as well as demographic experience and all of that. So it can reduce if the assets aren't enough to kind of meet what's already been awarded. In the DB section, members accrue 380ths. That amount that's originally accrued is guaranteed by the company, and any increases that are awarded become guaranteed, but there are no future increases guaranteed. That guarantee is what makes it a DB section, obviously. You'll see we're contributing 13.6% of pensionable pay and members contributing 6%, which, as I say, is kind of broadly similar to our existing schemes. I will pop onto the next slide because I don't think you need loads and loads of detail on our scheme design. So this is just talking a little bit about, where we're at now. So obviously, when the scheme was designed back in 2018 and agreed with our union, the legislation didn't exist to allow a CDC scheme in the UK. So there was much work done with government over that time. And, 4 years later, we're nearly there. We've got the primary legislation in place at the beginning of last year, secondary legislation basically coming in now. And we're expecting the regulator to be ready to accept applications for authorisation in the summer. So huge amount of progress has been made, and we really appreciate the kind of effort and importance that government, DWP, regulator have put on this and in getting as far as it has already. And we're really excited that we're just so much closer than we ever have been before. There are a few steps to go through around some of the more minor legislation over the next few months. And obviously for us and the trustees of the scheme getting ready to make that application for authorisation, hopefully in the summer. We recently formally consulted with our unions and our people over the changes. Anytime you change a pension scheme, you have to do a formal consultation. We use that as a consultation, but also as a real opportunity to start talking about the scheme and to kind of start communicating in the language we wanted to use going forward and things like that. Based on the feedback we heard, still really convinced, and so are the unions, that this is the right pension plan for our people, for the company. We're well on our way to setting it up, hopefully looking to go live towards the end of this year or the beginning of next year.
Angela, thanks very much. That's a great introduction for us. I must say those benefits are pretty impressive. I think I'd be very happy to be a member of the Royal Mail Pension Scheme. So maybe if I could add Posty onto my list of portfolio career, that'd be good. And incidentally, I will mention, we've had the same Posty at my house for the last 20 years now. And Michael is really, really keen about his new pension scheme. So press on with that delivery and get it there for him, please. We'll move on now to our second speaker, which is Maddie Kane from Aon.
Thank you, Adrian. So Royal Mail and government have done a great job turning this new pension design into reality. However, there are only so many employers in the UK that have this scale to set up and run a CDC scheme on their own. What this has done is act as a springboard to widen out to allow multi-employer schemes such as industry-wide and commercial master trusts to provide a CDC solution. But how would that work? Well, I'd like us to take a look at an example which can apply to all forms of multi-employer CDC schemes. If you could move to the next slide, please, Alex. So each employer would likely want its own contribution rate. For instance, here we have employer 1 at 10% of pensionable salaries, employer 2 is 15%, and for employer 3 it's 20%. But that just means that a member of employer 3 will build up benefits twice as fast as a member of employer 1. And essentially, all that members are really doing is just buying units of CDC benefits. Once they've been bought, all those units can then be aggregated, which means that longevity and investment risk can be pooled across all members in the scheme, not just members of the same employer. At least in principle, there are two basic models that a master trust might offer: whole of life CDC or decumulation only CDC. With whole of life CDC, a member is contributing to a CDC pension, getting benefit statements, showing that target pension in retirement, and then retiring in the master trust with a CDC pension. And with decumulation only CDC, the member is simply buying a CDC pension at the point of retirement. So up until that time, they're just building up a DC pot. So decumulation only has some attractions, such as members are deciding to have a CDC pension at a time when they're making decisions generally about their retirement benefits. But it also has some disadvantages, such that members would still be seeing the DC pot in their benefit statements up to retirement, which is hard to then translate to a standard of living in retirement. And I know many of you might be wondering how cross subsidies are dealt with in a multi-employer scheme. That is, cross subsidies between members of different ages and between different employers on account of differences in the age profile of their membership. Well, this can be managed if you have an accrual rate structure where the accrual rate varies by both age and over time. So, for instance, 10% contribution buys more pension for a younger member than an older member, and so the accrual rates would reflect that. If we can move to the next slide, please, Alex. I'd now like to briefly talk about the value that CDC can bring for savers, employers, and providers. So, for savers, if we put individual annuity purchase to one side, given that it's fallen out of favour, the majority of DC savers will have to make complex financial and investment decisions about the timing and shape of how they draw down their pension benefits in retirement. That leaves DC savers open to the risk of achieving poor outcomes due to a lack of understanding of all those factors that they need to consider. CDC removes the need for those complex decisions at and throughout retirement. And to put this into context, the Office for National Statistics estimates that the average UK life expectancy of a 65-year-old, is 86 years, but with a 25% probability of dying before age 80 and a 20% chance of living beyond age 93. So in other words, a 65-year-old has a 50% chance of their actual lifespan lying somewhere within a 13-year age range. That means DC savers have a very material challenge to decide how to budget for this uncertainty. If they had a CDC benefit instead, they wouldn't be exposed to this risk because CDC schemes provide a pension for life. For employers, this will open the door for many more to be able to offer CDC to their workforce, and in doing so will enable schemes to build scale and drive costs down for each employer. One of the attractions of a multi-employer scheme is likely to be the ready-made benefit and investment strategy design. However, we do expect that these schemes will enable a degree of flexibility for employers by having, say, a menu of suitable connected contribution and accrual rate designs to choose from. Our analysis shows that CDC outcomes could be as much as 33% higher, much of this being driven by their potential for generating high returns, both as a result of their much longer time horizon for investing than individual DC and ability to have a higher allocation in this time period to growth assets. Our 20 DC survey revealed that over 60% of DC members want an income for life, yet FCA stats show that only 10% are buying annuities. This represents a significant unmet need and one that the provider market can help address with product development. Providers have a natural ability to build assets and accumulation, and with CDC, they get to retain those into retirement as CDC delivers a default in-house pension. And given this longer term investment horizon, CDC schemes have a greater potential than DC schemes to invest in the liquid assets. There's employers and CDC provision, something Guy Offerman has echoed since he published Government's Response to 2018, and something we're also seeing in our discussions with client and industry. We move on to the next slide, please, Alex. So now we've covered the value that CDC could bring to savers, employers and providers. Let me now turn to where CDC goes from here and how it looks set to evolve in the UK. We already have legislation in place that will allow CDC schemes to be set up by single employer groups. And I expect we'll see by the end of this year, DWP's views on what it intends to regulate for in terms of multi-employer, master trust and decumulation only CDC options. I think that the next wave of CDC schemes will likely come from employers who share similar characteristics as Royal Mail, so paternalistic, possibly also unionised employers with large workforces. Doesn't need to be the same size as Royal Mail's workforce, but 5,000 plus employers ought to be sufficient. And those looking to review their current pensions and reward strategy. That can be employers either looking to close DB schemes to bring cost certainty or looking to provide an alternative to DC if it's not delivering for their members. Or even those just looking to harmonise from a mishmash of both DB and DC. But what I think will bring the masses is the evolution of CDC in commercial master trusts, providing a target income life to decumulation options. Back to you, Adrian.
Maddie, thank you very much for that insight. I thought those longevity numbers are just horrifying. That, if you've gone into an income drawdown plan and you're hoping that it's going to last as long as you last, in fact, you've only got a 50-50 chance that you're going to die in a window from age 80 up to age 93, and a 50-50 chance of dying outside of that window. It just shows the impossibility that faces people trying to run drawdown on a limited budget. There's two things I just wanted to touch on before we throw the session open to audience questions. That's about upgrading your existing DC scheme to CDC, and it's about decumulation only CDC schemes. So beginning with what I'm a firm believer in this concept of upgrading a DC scheme into CDC. By way of reference, I look at the history of DC, and many traditional employers, they set up a DC scheme simply to escape from DB, with trustees and regulators pursuing, perhaps needlessly, ever more risk-averse strategies. The annual cost of DB contributions was increasing, and the employer's balance sheet was threatened with escalating pension deficits. So they escaped to DC. And meanwhile, newer employers, faced with a statutory requirement to auto-enroll staff into a pension scheme, often found that DC was the only game in town for brand new schemes. Yet today, DC is offering inadequate and unpredictable pensions. I think that as a nation, we're sleepwalking into a demographic catastrophe that will see a generation of pensioners living in poverty. Compared to the retirement living standards developed by trade body PLSA with help from Loughborough University, 3/4 of those relying on DC pensions will fall below what is described as a moderate standard of living. The inadequacy for many is compounded by the lottery of investment returns. So some will do well, some will do not well, depending upon economic conditions during the critical growth period of their assets. CDC, in contrast, is just a much more efficient pension scheme. By harnessing the power of a collective approach to retirement savings, CDC can be much more efficient. For the same contribution, workers can expect to receive a greater income in retirement. And I love Maddie's number that it could be 30+% more. I see it as just like upgrading your central heating to an efficient condensing boiler. You can expect a warmer house for the same amount of gas burned. Now, CDC as a collective approach, costs are reduced by bringing large numbers of people together. A collective investment strategy enables the trustees to produce the best investment return without the constraints of the de-risking requirements of DC or the reserving requirements of annuities. And through seeing retirement as a shared experience, the focus is moved from trying to preserve pension assets to an inheritance onto extracting the maximum income throughout retirement for all pensioners. So the timetable for upgrading your scheme to a CDC kind of kicks off on 1st of August 2022. That's the date when the legislation comes into effect. We think the first one is going to be the Royal Mail scheme, launching for 150,000 odd postal workers. Great news, Andrew, doing really well there. Other large employers can start planning their upgrade now and follow in the footsteps trod by the postmen and women. And small employers, as Maddie was saying, will need to collaborate together in the spirit of collectivism, and government, we are told, will bring forward legislation in 2023 and 2024 to extend CDC to industry-wide employer schemes and to master trusts that can embrace all employers and even the self-employed. If you're sitting there worried that the legislative timetable in Parliament is very, very constrained, then don't panic, because when we talk to DWP, they tell us the primary legislation already passed, Pension Schemes Act 2021, is wide enough that by secondary legislation only, it can be extended to include these multi-employer schemes and master trusts. And there isn't the same pressure on parliamentary time for secondary legislation. So that's really, really good news. This legislation really can come and it can fit into the parliamentary timetable. So my message is very simple in this sense. If you're running a DC scheme today, it's time to start planning your upgrade to CDC. The second thing I just wanted to touch on was about decumulation CDC. It's an area that I'm very, very excited about. I know there's a lot of other people in the industry excited about it too. It's to provide a wage for life at retirement for people who've saved up their money in ordinary DC schemes. So they've been in a DC workplace scheme or a personal pension, a stakeholder pension, a SIP, and they can bring those assets together at retirement, transfer them into a decumulation CDC scheme, and then get a wage for life, something that meets the basic human need for an income from your pension savings, an income that doesn't run out if you live too long, an income that increases with the cost of living. And boy, is that relevant today, because yesterday we heard that RPI hit 8.2%. That's the highest level of inflation for 30 years. So schemes that are investing so that they can deliver pensions that will increase with the cost of living are really, really important. And in CDC, you can also have an income that will cater for the needs of the spouse or partner left behind, should the main life be the first to die. And don't forget, 2/3 of pensioners live in couples today. It provides a higher income than annuities, because compared to an annuity, the CDC scheme is freed up from the reserving and investment restrictions that are imposed on annuity providers. It provides a more stable income than drawdown because of its collective experience. I think the market potential for decumulation CDC is absolutely enormous. I look at the ABI figures. They're a bit more modest than the FCA figures, but the ABI figures show 120 odd thousand people per year buying a drawdown plan, 9 billion of assets going into drawdown, about 60,000 a year still buying an annuity, about 4 billion a year of assets going into individual annuities. And it's not just about people as they arrive at retirement and buying one of these. There's already a sort of ready-made backlog of people who have bought an income drawdown plan and are working their way through consuming that. They could switch across to a new CDC decumulation scheme and really get that off to a very, very rapid start. Do you know there's a frightening 110 billion pounds of assets sat in drawdown at the moment, so it doesn't need very many of those to want to switch across to CDC to say that we could be up and running very, very quickly. There are some design and regulatory issues around, running a CDC decumulation scheme. I know TPR are particularly interested in a number of those, but I see all of those as sitting in the solvable problem camp. It's an exciting space coming ahead of us, both in terms of decumulation CDC and in terms of employers looking to upgrade existing DC schemes to CDC, but it's one that I think we will be able to tackle together. So we're going to move across now into the audience questions. And lots are coming. Wow, thank you very much for sending all these fantastic questions in. So let me start with one which is about where did I have it now? It's gone. Sorry about this. It's about feedback. So Angela, I think it's really going to be a question for you. In terms of what feedback have you managed to gather from members, and how will you go about gathering feedback from members as you launch the Royal Mail scheme and it goes on, and what sort of level of engagement are you hoping to achieve?
Yep, so obviously how you understand whether or not members are engaging with and understanding the kind of materials that you put out there is really important. So we did focus groups a few years ago when we first started talking about CDC. They said some interesting things. For example, they said, stop bagging on about the fact that it can go down, it also goes up, and don't kind of undersell it. So things like kind of giving honest comms. So it's, actually in most cases, a CDC pension will increase in it, and it's expected broadly to increase with or above inflation, but sometimes it might go down, and you should expect that. So there was some interesting feedback we heard around, don't overplay the risks involved in the scheme actually, but also the same feedback you hear whenever you talk to people about pensions. Please use simple language. Please just tell me what I need to know, and not a whole load of things that your lawyers told you we needed to know, but actually we don't really. So lots of interesting feedback then, and we used the outcomes of that. So that it came out, the outcome of that was a bunch of questions that people had about, how it works and what they need to do, and we used that feedback to shape the consultation that we did. So we kind of explicitly said we're answering the key 6 questions you had last time we asked in this consultation, and we structured the consultation around people's feedback explicitly. We've done focus groups since then on, how did the consultation land? Did people read it? If they didn't, why didn't they? Was it still not quite simple enough for them? Was it a bit too long? It's quite hard to keep a consultation short because there are so many legal requirements, but was it too long? Did it have enough pictures in it? Was it engaging? So we've asked lots of questions on that. And again, what we're doing with that is taking all those learnings and we're sharing them with the trustee of the scheme as well, so that they can understand, what we did well, what we maybe could have improved on, so that when we talk to members going forward, and they do, that we do it as well as we possibly can. As I say, it will be iterative. I mean, comms is never easy in pensions anyway, and then we've got 135,000 people in over 1,000 locations, so it's not like you can call a meeting and explain everyone how their pension scheme works. So we've got multiple channels that we use to communicate with our staff. It's which of those ones that people engage with. So it's just a big kind of learning exercise really for us, and making sure that we take all those learnings and that we share them with the trustee as well.
Angela, thanks for that. I'm looking at the question board, and one which is shot to the top with 6 people voting for it is on the area of ill health benefits. Obviously, traditionally within DB schemes, ill health benefit has been a sort of critical facility. I wonder if I could come first to you, Angela, and then I'll move on to you, Maddie. Angela, in terms of the Royal Mail scheme, what are you able to do in terms of ill health benefits for a postee or one of your employers that suffers health during their career?
Yeah, so I mean, the scheme design actually quite closely mirrors the career average DB scheme we had. So it does include ill health benefits. So, for example, unreduced benefits if you reach a certain level of ill health. So for actives and deferred, unreduced benefits. But because essentially it's the liabilities are valued like a DB scheme, that can be done within the structure we've got. So you can choose what benefits you want to apply. You can choose what kind of spouses or dependents benefits you might want, what kind of ill health benefits you want, and we've designed it similar to the one we had. We've also got an income protection policy that's separate, but it's actually quite a flexible way of doing pensions.
Thank you for that. Maddie, if I could turn to you in terms of sort of design issues of creating the next generation of CDC schemes. When you talk to employers, has ill health been an issue they've raised, and what is it that you're able to, perhaps offer them or direct them towards?
Yeah, so I was going to start with just answering the particular question first, and I'll come on to the multi-employer aspect of it. So potentially yes to allowing for different mortality expectations, for instance, white collar versus blue collar, average benefit versus individual enhanced annuity. That's going to depend on circumstances. It's like DB. If you're an unmarried smoker, a DB transfer value based on averages is going to look relatively more attractive to you. In the context of the multi-employer scheme environment, yes, it is going to be something that we expect a scheme will factor into their design. Ill health is considered to be, a valuable benefit. How that would precisely work would depend on the whole mix of the benefit structure itself and the contribution structure. But we expect many to be offering similar benefits to Royal Mail in terms of how that may look.
Thanks. Excellent. Now, I want to look on, and there's a question around appetite here. There was, of course, a film with a famous slogan, "Build it and they will come." I think government have fairly firmly said they are not in the build it and they will come market. They want to understand that there is a demand for CDC before they advance each stage of the legislation. So, Maddie, and I think this is more a question for you. Do you think there's going to be much appetite for CDC in multi-employer settings from next year?
So, pending the legislation for multi-employer CDC, yes, I do think there's going to be appetite for it. And I think that's just going to grow from now on as soon as Royal Mail is formally launched. And in addition to that, we're seeing a lot more of our clients talking to us about CDC, and interested ones in particular, and ones that want to help inform the next stages. So, we conducted last year a CDC quiz in order to better understand how companies are perceiving CDC. And we've got over 400 responses there, with around half of them saying that they would want to consider setting up a CDC in its wider form.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm expecting it because I think that adequacy is increasingly going to be a topic which is raised and discussed within pension circles. I know at the moment it's difficult to think about increasing contributions with the cost of living crisis going on, but I am aware of a number of breakthrough pieces of academic research that are being undertaken about the level of adequacy of pensions in the UK today. And employers will be rightly worried when they see that their employees are not getting adequate pensions. And I think the beauty of CDC is that the answer to adequacy within CDC doesn't automatically mean pay more in. It's saying you could keep the contributions the same if you're an employer running a DC scheme today, but switch it to CDC and you can get better benefits, and so hit some of those PLSA adequacy targets. Why multi-employer? I think it's about spreading the cost and the burden. If you've been reading the material that TPR have been producing about applying for authorization. It looks a bit like the Master Trust authorization. Some people have suggested to me, oh, they've done a cut and paste job, Adrian. And having taken a Master Trust through authorization, then I can say it's a tough task. It involves quite a lot of effort and a lot of people, but it's thoroughly doable. But if you're a modest-sized employer or a small employer, you probably wouldn't want to do that by yourself. But if you could join a multi-employer scheme, an industry-wide scheme, a master trust, where somebody centrally has done that hard work of getting through that authorization and acquiring that important authorization status, then, join with some of your fellow employers, share the burden. I'm looking on, and in fact, I see a question which follows quite naturally on from that. Henry Tapper has raised the question: the pensions regulator has produced a tough-looking CDC code. Does the panel think it will help or hinder employers to choose CDC, whether for themselves or as part of a multi-employer scheme? Angela, if I could come to you first, I'm sure you've read that code with interest, because that's going to be your sort of burden of workload for the coming months. How are you setting about tackling, all those things that the code is going to require you to demonstrate to the regulator?
Yeah, I mean, I think the code, is stringent. It does place a high demand on trustees of CDC schemes and sponsors. Our perspective is that actually, broadly, we welcome that because, as the first to go, we've put a lot of effort into making sure our scheme is sustainable, that it works, that it's well designed, that it's affordable, all of those things. And actually, for CDC to work, schemes have to be successful. And so we welcome them being well regulated so that kind of the people who follow us do well and don't kind of bring CDC, make it less successful. I mean, there's a lot of detail in the code, and there are bits and pieces where we might view it as a bit further than we would have gone. But actually, we are still confident that our trustees, with our support, can get through that process, and that it will get where it needs to, and that the supervision regime will be appropriate as well. So I do appreciate that if we were a smaller employer, it might look a bit more daunting. We've already invested a lot in our CDC scheme, so this is just a kind of continued investment in that, I would say.
Thanks. Maddie, some thoughts from you about whether the CDC code will help or hinder employers that are looking to choose CDC?
So I kind of agree with you, Adrian, that I think that the starting point has been the Master Trust Code, and hence why it might appear that there's such a high bar for smaller employers to set up CDC schemes. So some of the higher bar items that came out for me really was everything to do with about more stringent requirements on checking member communications and making sure members really understand CDC risks. So I think I echo what Angela has said about this has to be a rigorous process. We need to ensure that schemes entering this market do have a viable structure and one that's resilient as well.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I look at it and I think we really need this tough regulation as a way of actually protecting employers, because a key feature of a CDC scheme is that the employer input is fixed. Unlike DB, where they've got an open-ended commitment, and sometimes it comes as a bit of a surprise to the finance director when he's told he needs to increase contributions by his trustees. In the space of CDC, those contribution increases are not there. But employers need that reassurance that, yes, they are not going to have to pay more into a CDC scheme, no matter what happens. And I think the fact that the schemes are going to be, heavily regulated and authorized by TPR actually provides that assurance that this scheme is going to be, thoroughly well driven, thoroughly well understood by its members. There will never be a clamour from anybody to say the employer needs to be putting more in because the scheme hasn't done what it said on the tin and so forth. And I think that protection for employers is very, very important as they think about moving themselves forward, into a CDC space. I'm looking at our question list, and we've got another one, which is a particular Royal Mail one, so that's quite interesting. Angela, it's about investments, and it's asking about what is your, launch investment strategy likely to be, within the Royal Mail CDC scheme.
So I thought this question might come up, and Alex, who's in the background somewhere, who has my slides, there's a couple of slides at the end of that deck which have a nice picture of what our investment strategy will look like. But broadly, our scheme is designed to hold return-seeking assets in respect of all pensions that are still pre-retirement, and then to de-risk slowly as people go through retirement. So this is the slide I was talking about. So what you can see there, so this is the assets that are held to back kind of a particular individual's pension. So as they go up to retirement of age 67, it's entirely held in a return-seeking asset portfolio, and then it switches down between 67 and 90. So quite different from your typical default in a DC scheme, where you'd start de-risking probably around age 50 in a scheme like that. So, much longer investment in return-seeking assets. That's a big part of the reason why our CDC scheme is kind of, the modelling shows it outperforms a DC scheme. You're able to kind of remain invested for a much longer period of time. What that return-seeking asset portfolio looks like is probably, we're still working on that with the trustees, and we set out kind of guidance for them to work within. But essentially, it's a kind of equity-like portfolio, probably with some more private assets in it than a typical DC fund might have, because it can take advantage of the fact that, this scheme will have £50 million a month for going into it. So huge amounts of money to invest. So kind of equities with some private markets on the side. The low risk portfolio, if you swap to the next slide, you'll see just how long the low risk portfolio kind of remains irrelevant almost for. So this is the holding of low risk assets. So you see it doesn't even get to 2% of the portfolio until 15 years in. So from day one, our scheme will be invested, short of a little bit of liquidity that might be needed, essentially fully in a return-seeking portfolio, which is broadly equities plus some kind of more interesting private market type products. So yeah, you can see compared to a DB scheme in particular, and even compared to a DC scheme, it's invested to kind of access that economic returns in a way that the other schemes aren't.
I think that first graph that Angela showed us there, that de-risking profile, was absolutely fascinating, because I've seen that graph so often in a DC setting, and it's just shifted a whole load to the left with the de-risking phase beginning earlier. But your thoughts have just got me thinking DB as well. And if I try to think about what a DB scheme's doing, the sort of huge amounts of money that we're seeing going into insurer buyout vehicles to get that security that the trustees and DB members would love, is also showing an enormous switch in DB schemes out of return seeking assets and into very low risk assets. So I see you outperforming both DC and DB there. Maddie, if I could turn across to you on the question of investments, I wonder how that resonates with the employers you've been talking to, but also whether you think there's good scope within CDC for some of those sort of green, bounce back assets that government have been encouraging us to put into pension schemes to sort of fire up British industry, build that levelling up in the Midlands and the North that we so desperately need, get some of that infrastructure which will reduce our exposure to nasty assets like gas and oil that might be being piped across from Russia and things. Maddie, thoughts on assets and bringing some of those assets that the government would like us to be putting pensions money in?
Yeah, so I think that when we talk about CDC, we're talking naturally about accumulation and decumulation. So we've got this much longer time horizon than say a DC scheme, and with that much longer time horizon as well, we would expect that there be a greater holding of growth assets there, but also in constructing that portfolio, taking account of, you know, the actual and expected membership and you know, the kind of ages and lifespan there. So it's almost like you're constructing an individual. For DC, you'd be constructing an individual investment strategy, and then you'll be aggregating all of those. And then the overlay to that is, do you know what, we've got this longer time horizon. So yes, I do see that there'd be more potential within CDC for having a higher allocation to growth assets. And when we talk about, you know, the better outcomes, a lot of that is driven by the fact that we can hold a higher allocation. Do I think that you know, they're the kind of vehicle that would be able to, you know, fly the flag for liquid assets, green assets in particular? I think yes. I think that's one of the areas that CDC could actually, you know, fly the flag on, and naturally, I think it's a good fit as well, having those less liquid assets within that portfolio. And I also see they would be able to build scale in a very short space of time as well. So in terms of, you know, some of the conversations that we're having with clients, we're seeing this kind of interest come in when we have the discussions around the investment strategy.
If you don't mind me jumping in, I was just going to add that, you know, because we obviously ESG, especially climate change, huge on everybody's agenda, and, you know, huge on our agenda as a business, agenda of our DB scheme. But in some ways, I look at our CDC scheme and think it absolutely has to be right and done from day one well for our CDC scheme, because actually the duration of that scheme, the longevity of that scheme is, you know, it's designed to be paying out benefits for 50, you know, however many decades. It will see through the climate transition, you know, whereas, you know, a well-funded DB scheme might move to an insurance company. It's largely invested in gilts. A DC scheme has that shorter duration because people only in it up to retirement. A CDC scheme, you know, and one of our size with the kind of level of assets it will have very quickly, it's absolutely crucial that, you know, the trustees create an investment strategy with climate change front of mind.
Lovely, thank you. Now, a tough question has come in, which Alex has posted up for us. I'm going to go through this one at you, Maddie, and it's, why will CDC flower now when 10 years ago Steve Webb's defined ambition arrangements kind of withered on the vine? Maddie, what is it that makes it right for CDC at the moment?
So I guess it's the issues that CDC solves are totally relevant of today's DC savers, really. You know, how to get an income for life from DC savings in an efficient way. With defined ambition, I think that was too broad and detracted from the, you know, the specific positives that CDC can add. So, you know, the evidence is CDC is with us now and DA isn't.
Lovely, thank you. Angela, anything in that as to why was it that, you know, Royal Mail felt now was the right time to launch a CDC scheme?
Yeah, I was almost going to come at it from the other direction, which actually is when you said the government isn't going to build it and they'll come. I think that might be what they tried with defined ambition. And then actually, because there was a real demand from a large employer, you know, with 120,000 people ready to join a scheme of this sort, they built the legislation not for us and us alone, but prompted by us, I would say. So it's almost the other way around. It was almost that a large enough employer with enough clout got to the point of wanting a scheme like that, and the government built what was needed to make that possible.
Thank you. I guess I'd add on to that. My own thought is that we are now 10 years further down the road towards the point where DC assets exceed DB assets. In fact, globally they do. It's Willis Towers Watson that run a global survey that has claimed that when you look at it globally, DC has now exceeded DB. That's not the case in the UK yet. And you can go on the TPR website and they've got a plot going forward that suggests we've got about another 10 years yet in the UK before the DC assets exceed the DB. But we are now seeing significant numbers of people coming through and arriving at retirement where DC is the majority of their pension assets. And that compared to 10 years ago, where people had a very large amount of DB still and perhaps a bit of DC as a sort of bit of, icing on the top. It is putting us in a different position, and it is very much exposing the difficulty that people face at, retirement age with a DC pension in terms of choosing a pot. Let's rattle on because we're going to run out of time, and I did promise us we would finish on time. A popular question is, how will the pensions tax regime work for members of CDC schemes? And perhaps I could tag on to that the next question, which is about what is it that members are expected to pay in, and indeed, is there a scope for an AVC from a member that wants to pay a bit more in? Angela, could I come to you for a comment on how does the tax work for CDC, and can members pay a bit more in? Or?
Yep. So, I mean, I will obviously caveat it with I'm not a tax expert and don't consider this advice or anything. But my understanding is that the way that the tax issues work for a CDC scheme is that the lifetime allowance is considered in a similar way to DB. So you kind of multiply the pension by a certain number, and the annual allowance is considered more on a contributions basis. So it's more like a DC. So it's a bit of a mix and match of the way the tax regime works currently. Sorry, I lost track of your second question.
AVCs. Can your members pay AVCs on top of the scheme contribution that they're being asked to pay?
Yeah. So in our scheme, AVCs will be an option. Initially, AVCs will be an option for the DB lump sum section. We'll have the option to have a matched AVC that goes into the DB section, and a DC AVC kind of sidecar saving as well. Schemes, it could potentially, as I understand it, have CDC AVCs as well, where people built up extra CDC pension. That's not the current intention for our plan.
Lovely, thank you. Maddie, anything to add in terms of member contributions, AVCs, anything in that space?
Possibly on the tax issue. So it's at retirement, where Angela was saying that it'll be like 20 times the pension at retirement. However, the rules are going to be a little bit more flexible for what pension is allowed, because CDC pensions might go up as well as down. So probably the best way to think about this is it's DC in accumulation up to the point of retirement. It's DB in terms of how the tax regime works or is intended to work. With AVCs, I think it's going to be very much a design feature of each scheme as to whether or not they allow members to pay AVCs in, or whether they have a separate vehicle for AVCs. So I guess that's kind of like let's wait and see, really, to see how that pans out.
Lovely, thank you. We're coming close to time, so one final question. Alan, what seems to be next most popular is around pension increases. I mean, we all like to have an increase every year, but like wage increases. Angela, within the Royal Mail scheme, how would you go about calculating what increase, are you actually going to give to the, both men and women each year?
So a tricky question for 2 minutes from the end, because I could spend an hour talking about this alone. But to keep it as brief as I possibly can, essentially, every year the trustees will ask the scheme actuary to do a calculation of the liabilities in the scheme and compare that to the assets. So the way the scheme is designed is that liabilities are always calculated on a best estimate basis, so kind of central assumptions used for calculating liabilities, and the assets are taken obviously at market value on that date. And what the scheme actuary needs to do is essentially make those match, so that the assets always match the liabilities. And what is worked out is within that asset amount you've got, what increase can be afforded and what increase can be afforded indefinitely. So in our scheme, that will be kind of put as a CPI plus or minus. So the actuary will say, given the assets you've got and the benefits you've built up and expected future demographics, we think that the scheme can afford CPI indefinitely, or CPI plus a half indefinitely, or CPI plus one, whatever it is in that year. And then that calculation is done each year. So if the assets fall from one year to the other, it might be that the first year an increase was awarded of CPI plus one, because that was the long-term expectation. And then the following year it's CPI plus a half, and then it could go up or down. So as I say, I could spend an hour talking about that. Hopefully that was a half decent explanation for a minute and a half.
Angela, thank you very much. We look with interest to see how that flows on. We are, coming up to the end of my time, so it just follows for me to do two things. The first is to thank our panelists, Angela Goff from Royal Mail and Maddie Kane from Aon. Thank you both very much for sharing, your views and expertise on CDC with us. That's brilliant. And lastly, for the audience, thank you for coming. And if you would like to come to our next one, there's a little green banner box at the bottom of the screen that you can click. Our next webinar in a month's time is another one in our series of SIP versus SAS. It's been a hugely popular series. And this time in particular, we will be looking around at the issue of what happens when the boss decides to sell the business. Is it easier to extract your pension assets if they're tied up in a SIP or in a SAS? We've spent our hour. We've had a great time. It's 1 o'clock. I said to let you know. So thank you, audience. Thank you, speakers. Cheerio. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining.